I happened at the time to be below the Mason-Dixon line, you see.
No,
And Mr.
something smaller is probably easier to take care of.
Okie dokie.
It is so very wonderful to me. It's such a sweet, ripe flower of a lady.
Disney doesn't forget things. They buried them. Behind the fairy dust and the family-friendly empire sits a vault so deep that entire cartoons, entire series, entire worlds of animation have been swallowed whole and never spoken of again. We're not talking about the classics. We're talking about 25 brilliant cartoons that Disney scrubbed so clean from public memory that even die-hard animation fans have no idea they ever existed. This is the side of Disney's animation history that no documentary covers, no theme park celebrates, and no streaming service wants you to find. 25 cartoons that the most powerful entertainment company on the planet decided the world was better off not seeing. And once you hear what they contain, you'll understand exactly why Disney wanted them gone. Number 25, The Wuzzles, 1985.
Hey, Rhinoki! Flance at 6 o'clock low! Stop him!
In 1984, Michael Eisner had just taken over as CEO of the Walt Disney Company. The studio was bleeding money. Its theatrical animation division was directionless, and its television animation department didn't even exist yet. So Eisner did something nobody at Disney had ever attempted before. He sat down with Gary Crisell, Jim Magon, and animator Tad Stones, and told them to build an entirely new division from scratch, one dedicated solely to producing animated television. The first idea that stuck was The Wuzzles, a show about hybrid animals, half one species, half another, living on a fantasy island called Wuzz. The concept was so strange and so specific that production actually began before the television animation division was even formally created. Behind the scenes, Disney partnered with Hasbro to co-develop the characters. The whole operation ran on a compressed timeline, using simplified backgrounds and recycled animation cycles to stay on schedule. Unfortunately, only 13 episodes of The Wuzzles were produced. Number 24, Raw Tunage, 1992.
If there's one thing we pigs know, it's construction.
Well, Mr. Wolf.
By 1992, Disney television animation was riding high. DuckTales had conquered the afternoon. Darkwing Duck was a cult hit. The Disney afternoon programming block was the most dominant force in children's television. So when the studio launched an animated anthology series called Raw Tunage on CBS that September, it seemed like a guaranteed win. In reality, it was anything but. Raw Tunage was born out of chaos. Initially, Disney had been developing a 65-episode series called He's Bonkers D. Bobcat for the Disney afternoon block, but the production was a mess. At the same time, Michael Eisner had personally purchased the animation rights to Marsupilami, created by legendary cartoonist Andre Franquin in 1952. Someone at Disney had the idea to combine these troubled productions into a single anthology series. Take the unfinished Bonkers shorts, pair them with new Marsupilami cartoons, and a pop culture parody segment called Totally Tasteless Videos. Wrap it all with a different Disney character hosting each week, and call it Raw Tunage. Yes, it was brilliant, but only 12 episodes aired before CBS canceled it. Number 23, Fluffy Dogs, 1986.
Where, darling? I don't see any.
What was that?
Before there was DuckTales, before Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, before Disney television animation became the empire that dominated Saturday mornings for over a decade, there was an hour-long animated special about interdimensional talking dogs that was supposed to change everything, and it was dead on arrival. Fluffy Dogs aired on ABC on Thanksgiving night, November 27, 1986. Disney positioned it as a holiday event. The concept was wild for its time. Initially, the original Fluffy Dogs designs were aimed squarely at young girls. 6 pastel-colored dogs, each with a distinct name, a distinct personality, and a distinct color, designed to work as collectible plush toys. But somewhere between conception and broadcast, Disney pivoted. The demographics target shifted toward boys. The dimension-hopping science fiction premise was added and amplified. The number of main characters dropped from 6 to 5. The result was a product caught between two audiences, built for a demographic that the studio kept changing its mind about. The creative pedigree was strong, the execution was solid, but none of it mattered. Fluffy Dogs scored a Nielsen rating of just 5.3 out of 10, placing 71st among all network programming that week. It was the lowest-ranked film ABC aired that entire period. Disney canceled the planned series immediately. Number 22. A Symposium on Popular Songs, 1962. A Symposium on Popular Songs was released on December 19, 1962, written by the Sherman brothers, Richard and Robert, who considered it one of their favorite Disney assignments. The premise was beautifully absurd. Professor Ludwig von Drake invites the audience into his mansion and proceeds to deliver a completely fictional lecture on the history of popular music, claiming that he personally invented every major genre of the 20th century. Ragtime, jazz, big band, crooners, doo-wop, rock and roll. Each genre was illustrated with its own original Sherman Brothers song, and here's where it gets truly unusual. While the Ludwig von Drake segments were animated in Disney's traditional hand-drawn style, every musical number was produced entirely in stop motion, using handcrafted figurines and cutout animation. This was one of the rarest techniques ever used inside the walls of Disney's own studio. The Sherman brothers, who had written all 7 songs, later named this as one of their favorite assignments in their entire Disney career. A Symposium on Popular Songs aired once as an episode of Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color on NBC, then disappeared from public view for over 4 decades. Number 21. Legend of the Three Caballeros, 2018. In 1944, Walt Disney released The Three Caballeros, a wildly experimental feature film that combined live action with animation, sent Donald Duck on a psychedelic musical journey through Latin America, and confused the absolute daylights out of every American critic who reviewed it. Over 7 decades later, Disney produced a brand new animated series based on those characters. It featured a stacked voice cast including Tony Anselmo, who had been voicing Donald Duck since the 1980s, alongside Jaime Camil as Panchito, Eric Bauza as Jose, Gray Griffin, Wayne Knight, Kevin Michael Richardson, and Jim Cummings. The show was directed by Matt Danner, who had to put together a special compilation reel of every terrible thing Donald Duck had ever done across his entire filmography, just to convince Disney executives that it was okay to portray Donald as a flawed character. The series drew from Carl Barks and Don Rosa comics, featured Daisy Duck's rarely seen nieces April, May, and June instead of the usual Huey, Dewey, and Louie, and wove Greek mythology together with Latin American folklore into a serialized adventure. The show was produced by Disney Digital Network and was originally intended for a summer 2017 release as a series of specials and a movie. Instead, it was quietly dumped onto the Disney Life streaming app exclusively in the Philippines on June 9, 2018. No press release, no trailer, no announcement. Number 20. Belle's Magical World, 1998. In 1991, Beauty and the Beast became the first animated film in history to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture. It earned over $425 million worldwide. The songs by Howard Ashman and Alan Menken became part of the American Songbook overnight. It was arguably the most beloved animated film Disney had ever made. So naturally, someone at Disney Television Animation decided the logical next step was to develop a weekly cartoon series based on it, set inside the Beast's castle, using television-quality animation and sitcom-level storylines. The series was canceled before it ever reached the air, but 3 episodes had already been fully produced. Rather than absorb the loss, Disney made a decision that would haunt its legacy for decades. They stitched those 3 unfinished, unrelated episodes together, called the result a movie, and shipped it direct-to-video as Belle's Magical World. Behind the scenes, the animation was a catastrophic downgrade from the original film. Characters went off model in nearly every scene. In fact, there is a moment so poorly drawn that fans have nicknamed it Derp Face Belle, where Belle's eyes wander in opposite directions during a reading scene. The 3 segments had no connective tissue. One is about Belle and the Beast learning forgiveness. Another is about Lumiere's girlfriend getting jealous. The third is about the Beast being kind to a bird. The morals were hammered into the ground. The characters were unrecognizable from their original portrayals. And yet, despite all of that, the VHS sold over 1 million copies in its first 2 days of release, making it one of the top 10 selling home videos of its era. Number 19. The Golden Touch, 1935. There is exactly one animated short film that Walt Disney himself was so embarrassed by that he forbade anyone at the studio from ever mentioning it in his presence. It wasn't a wartime propaganda reel. It wasn't an early experiment that didn't work. It was a silly symphonies cartoon called The Golden Touch, released on March 22, 1935, and it was the last film Walt Disney ever directed. The backstory is legendary. By the mid-1930s, Walt had stepped away from hands-on directing to focus on producing and overseeing the studio's rapidly expanding output. But a dispute arose between Walt and his animators over whether he could still direct a cartoon as well as the ones he was demanding from them. Walt took the challenge. He chose the Greek myth of King Midas, set it in a medieval world, and assigned himself only 2 animators to prove he could do it lean. Norm Ferguson handled King Midas. Fred Moore animated the mischievous elf Goldie. Albert Herder provided the storyboard sketches. The production cost $35,458. Musicland came in at $35,054. The Tortoise and the Hare cost $32,671. Walt had spent more money with fewer characters and no special effects to show for it. When the finished film screened, the reaction was devastating. The pacing was sluggish. The humor was flat. The moral felt heavy-handed rather than earned. Walt was humiliated. He canceled The Golden Touch abruptly and never directed another animated short again. Number 18. Alice's Wonderland, 1923. In 1920, a 19-year-old Walt Disney was working as a commercial artist at an advertising company in Kansas City, experimenting with animation in his spare time. He founded a small studio called Laugh-O-Gram, hired a handful of young animators, and produced a series of fairy tale adaptations. When their distributor, Pictorial Clubs of New York, went bankrupt before paying the studio what it was owed, Laugh-O-Gram was financially destroyed. Disney was so broke he was living in the office and bathing once a week at Union Station. A local dentist named Thomas McCrum offered him $500 to produce a short film about dental hygiene called Tommy Tucker's Tooth. Instead of paying his creditors with that money, Walt invested every dollar into an ambitious demonstration reel that mixed live action with animation, starring a young local girl named Virginia Davis as a child named Alice who wanders into a cartoon landscape. That film was Alice's Wonderland. Behind the scenes, Walt shot the live-action footage himself with his remaining staff, and UB Iwerks handled the bulk of the animation alongside Harmon and Ising. But here's the thing. Alice's Wonderland was never intended for theatrical release. It was a pitch reel, designed to show distributors what Disney could do. Laugh-O-Gram filed for bankruptcy in July 1923 anyway. Walt sold his camera, packed an unfinished print of Alice's Wonderland into his suitcase, and boarded a train to Los Angeles with almost nothing to his name. In Hollywood, he sent the reel to New York cartoon distributor Margaret Winkler, who was impressed enough to offer him a contract for a full series. That deal launched the Alice comedies, 56 shorts produced between 1923 and 1927, and led directly to the founding of the Disney Brothers Studio, which would become the Walt Disney Company. Number 17. Willie the Operatic Whale, 1946. Willie the Operatic Whale told the story of a sperm whale named Willie who possesses 3 uvulas, each producing a different vocal range, allowing him to sing tenor, baritone, and bass simultaneously. His dream is simple: to perform at the Metropolitan Opera. Every voice in the segment, every single character, was performed by one man, Nelson Eddy. Eddy was a classically trained baritone who had been the highest-paid singer in the world during his peak years at MGM, where he starred in 8 films opposite soprano Jeanette MacDonald. For Willie the Operatic Whale, Eddy delivered one of the most extraordinary vocal performances in animation history, singing excerpts from The Barber of Seville, Lucia de Lammermoor, and Martha, while simultaneously narrating Willie's tragic arc. Because the story ends in tragedy, Teddy Toddy catches Willie and harpoons him. The whale dies. The narrator tells the audience that Willie's voice, now split into 1,000 golden tones, will sing forever in heaven. The segment was later reissued as a standalone short in 1954, then buried on home video in the 1990s, and has remained one of the most emotionally devastating and least discussed pieces of animation Disney ever produced. Number 16. Motor City 2012. Chris Pernosky spent over a decade trying to get this show made. He first developed the concept around the year 2000, originally pitching it as a 26-episode series. When that fell through after MTV canceled his earlier show Downtown, Pernosky and his team moved on to create Megas XLR for Cartoon Network. But Motor City never left his mind. The show premiered on April 30, 2012, and it was unlike anything Disney had ever aired. Set in a dystopian future Detroit, The series imagined a gleaming corporate metropolis called Detroit Deluxe, built directly on top of the old city. The villain was Abraham Cain, voiced by Mark Hamill in full dark side mode. Beneath the surface, a ragtag crew of rebels called the Burners fought back with customized hot rods and sheer defiance. The animation was a hybrid of Flash, Maya, and After Effects, with hand-painted Photoshop backgrounds, producing a visual style so expensive and labor-intensive that industry insiders suspected the budget alone made Disney uncomfortable, so they systematically destroyed the show's chances from the inside. Number 15. Ferdinand the Bull, 1938. In 1936, an American author named Monroe Leaf sat down one afternoon with a yellow legal pad and in less than an hour wrote a children's story about a bull who would rather sit under a cork tree and smell flowers than fight in the ring. He gave it to his friend Robert Lawson to illustrate. What happened next was beyond anything either man could have predicted. The book became the most politically explosive piece of children's literature in the 20th century. Francisco Franco banned it in Spain as subversive pacifist propaganda. Adolf Hitler ordered copies destroyed, calling it degenerate democratic propaganda. Joseph Stalin, in a bizarre twist, granted it privileged status as the only non-communist children's book allowed in Poland. By 1938, the story of Ferdinand had been translated into over 60 languages. Seeing this, Walt Disney adapted it into a 7-minute animated short that same year, directed by Dick Rickard and narrated by radio personality Don Wilson. The matador in the cartoon was reportedly modeled after Walt himself, and the bullfighters were caricatures of Disney's own animators. But when Ferdinand the Bull aired, it only appeared briefly here and there in compilation materials before it vanished. Number 14. Suzie the Little Blue Coupe, 1952. Directed by Clyde Geronimi and based on an original story by Bill Peet. Before then, Peet was a Disney animator and story artist who had worked on features from Dumbo to Fantasia, but his real passion was writing stories for children. Suzie was one of his earliest personal narratives, a tale about a small blue car who begins life gleaming in a dealer showroom, gets purchased by a wealthy gentleman, and is treated with love. Behind the scenes, the animation was handled by a team that included Ollie Johnston, one of Disney's legendary 9 old men. But here's the detail that makes this short genuinely significant. The technique Peet and Geronimi used to anthropomorphize Suzie, placing her eyes in the windshield and using the glass as eyelids, was directly cited by Pixar director John Lasseter as the foundational inspiration for the character design of the entire Cars franchise. But today, the animation images have lapsed into the public domain, while the music within the film retains separate copyright protection. That split status has kept the complete film in a legal gray zone for decades. Number 13. Tron Uprising, 2012. In 2010, Disney spent $170 million making Tron Legacy, a dazzling neon-soaked sequel to the 1982 cult classic that grossed over $400 million worldwide. The studio saw franchise potential and immediately greenlit an animated series to expand the universe. They assembled a dream team. Charlie Bean was brought on as executive producer and director. Edward Kitsis and Adam Horowitz signed on as consulting producers. The voice cast was stacked with Hollywood talent. Guest stars across the season included Aaron Paul, Lance Reddick, Olivia Wilde, and John Glover. The animation blended 2D and CGI techniques, drawing visual inspiration from Star Wars, The Clone Wars, and Aeon Flux. The resulting aesthetic was genuinely unlike anything else on cable television in 2012. Clean, geometric, electric, and saturated with the deep blues and purples of the grid. The music was pulsing, electronic, and cinematically powerful. The show's themes of surveillance, authoritarianism, individual conscience against institutional power, and the cost of resistance had genuine weight. When Tron premiered, it was, by nearly every creative metric, a triumph. But then, Disney buried it. Number 12. Teacher's Pet, 2004. Nathan Lane was in the middle of Broadway rehearsals for the producers when Disney asked him to fly to New York recording sessions to voice a dog who desperately wanted to be a human boy. The project was Teacher's Pet. The show was created by artist Gary Baseman, whose deliberately off-kilter visual style looked nothing like standard Disney animation. The voice cast was absurdly talented. Lane led as Spot. Kelsey Grammer played the villain Dr. Ivan Crank. David Ogden Stiers, Jerry Stiller, Wallace Shawn, Paul Rubens and Estelle Harris filled out the ensemble. Deborah Jo Rupp from That 70s Show voiced Spot's owner. The songs were original compositions that reviewers compared to a rock opera, catchy and inventive enough that multiple critics suggested the film deserved a Broadway adaptation. But during production, Baseman's dog Hubcaps passed away. The film grossed just $6.5 million on a $10 million budget, making it the second worst performing wide release of the entire year. Number 11. The Little Match Girl, 2006. Roger Allers began work on The Little Match Girl in 2002. Initially, the plan was to assemble a collection of animated segments set to classical music, continuing the tradition Walt had started in 1940. But the project was never completed, and The Little Match Girl became an orphan, a fully produced segment for a film that would never exist. Behind the scenes, Allers set the story in pre-revolutionary Russia, depicting an unnamed girl trying to sell matches on a frozen street while pedestrians walk past her without a second glance. The entire short plays without dialogue. The animation was the final project ever produced using Disney's groundbreaking CAPS software. What made the production especially contentious was the ending. Anderson's original story ends with the girl dying in the snow, her spirit lifted away by her deceased grandmother. Disney executives asked Allers to develop alternate, more upbeat conclusions. He was called back from outside projects multiple times over 4 years. To attempt different versions, Allers refused to compromise. He fought to keep the ending faithful to Anderson's intent. Eventually, the executives relented. The finished short was released in July 2006, not in theaters, not as a standalone event, but as a bonus feature buried on the Platinum Edition DVD of The Little Mermaid. Number 10. The Wild, 2006. Here's a fact that would have changed the entire conversation if people had known it at the time. The Wild went into production before Madagascar, not after, before. The concept for a computer-animated film about zoo animals escaping into the wild was being developed at the Canadian animation studio CORE Feature Animation, years before DreamWorks announced their version. But Jeffrey Katzenberg, the former Disney executive who had left to co-found DreamWorks, reportedly got wind of the premise and fast-tracked Madagascar through production. DreamWorks beat Disney to theaters by a full year. Madagascar opened in May 2005 on a $75 million budget and made $558 million worldwide, launching a franchise worth billions. The Wild, on the other hand, limped into theaters. It earned just $102 million globally on an $80 million budget. Number 9. Make Mine Music, 1946. Walt Disney nearly went bankrupt trying to keep his studio alive during World War II. The U.S. government had effectively commandeered his facilities. His best animators had been drafted. What remained were fragments, orphaned pieces of animation that didn't belong to anything. Left with no choice, Walt took those fragments and stitched them into package films, cheap anthology features designed to keep the studio solvent until he could afford to make real movies again. Make Mine Music, released in April 1946, was the most disposable of these survival projects. Produced for just $1.35 million, the film contained 10 musical segments featuring popular acts of the era, including Benny Goodman, Dinah Shore, and the Andrews Sisters. It grossed $3.275 million in worldwide rentals and screened at the 1946 Cannes Film Festival. But here is where the story takes its strangest turn. Make Mine Music was never given a wide theatrical reissue. Instead, Disney broke it apart. The individual segments were separated and released as standalone shorts, scattered across television broadcasts and home video compilations over the following decades. Number 8. Dinosaur, 2000. In 1988, director Paul Verhoeven and stop-motion legend Phil Tippett conceived a darker, more naturalistic film about dinosaurs that would use cutting-edge stop-motion techniques to bring prehistoric creatures to life without human interference. There were no speaking characters, no musical numbers, no comic sidekicks, just dinosaurs surviving in a raw, unforgiving world. The budget reached $127.5 million. When Disney finally put the project into active production in the mid-1990s, the concept was radically altered. The dinosaurs were given voices. Talking lemurs were added. The primal tone was replaced with a conventional family adventure narrative. But the technical ambition remained staggering. Disney created an entirely new division called the Secret Lab, specifically to handle the film's unprecedented visual effects pipeline, which composited CGI dinosaurs onto real-world backgrounds that production crews had filmed across multiple continents. Dinosaur premiered and earned $349 million worldwide. Number 7. Home on the Range, 2004. Home on the Range cost $110 million to produce. It opened on April 2, 2004, finishing fourth at the box office behind Scooby-Doo 2, Monsters Unleashed, Walking Tall, and Hellboy. It earned just $50 million domestically and $145 million worldwide. The voice cast was loaded. Roseanne Barr, Dame Judi Dench, Jennifer Tilly, Cuba Gooding Jr., Randy Quaid, and Steve Buscemi all lent their voices. Behind the scenes, the film had originally been developed under the title Sweating Bullets, with a significantly darker tone. But executives pushed for a lighter, more family-friendly approach, and the story was reworked into a comedic western about 3 dairy cows trying to capture a cattle rustler who hypnotizes herds with his yodeling. The reviews were brutal. The animation itself was vibrant and technically accomplished. But after shooting, Disney had already swapped Home on the Range's release date with Brother Bear. By the time Home on the Range finally reached audiences, it felt like an afterthought even within its own studio. Number 6. Atlantis, The Lost Empire, 2001. When the directors of Beauty and the Beast finished The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1996, they told the studio they didn't want to make another musical. They wanted to make a Jules Verne-style adventure film. No singing, no romance arc, just pure action, exploration, and world-building. Disney let them try. The result was Atlantis, The Lost Empire. The story follows a young linguist named Milo Thatch, who assembles a crew of mercenaries to find the lost city of Atlantis. The voice cast was extraordinary. The visual style was built around the angular, shadowy artwork of Mike Mignola. Mignola served as one of 4 production designers and provided character designs, background concepts, and story ideas that gave the film a look unlike anything Disney had ever attempted. The budget landed around $120 million. Behind the scenes, linguist Mark Okrand was hired to construct an entire Atlantean language from scratch. James Newton Howard composed the score. The film was shot in anamorphic widescreen, one of the only Disney animated features ever presented in that format. It was also, at the time, the most CGI-heavy traditionally animated film Disney had ever produced. Atlantis opened and earned $186 million worldwide. Number 5. The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, 1949. The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad was released without a formal premiere. It was the 11th animated feature in the Disney canon, and the last of the 6 package films the studio had been forced to produce throughout the 1940s. The first half adapts Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows, with Rathbone guiding the audience through the misadventures of J. Thaddeus Toad. The second half adapts Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, with Crosby singing and narrating an increasingly terrifying story that climaxes in a nighttime chase sequence so meticulously animated, so perfectly paced, and so genuinely frightening that it remains one of the single greatest pieces of animation the studio ever produced. Number 4. The Reluctant Dragon, 1941. The Reluctant Dragon premiered in the middle of the most devastating labor dispute in animation history. On May 29, 1941, more than 500 Disney staffers had walked off the job, demanding fair pay, union recognition, and an end to what they described as a system of favoritism and exploitation. The strike would last nearly 4 months and permanently fracture the studio's workforce. Disney needed a feature film fast and cheap. The solution was a 74-minute hybrid that was essentially a guided tour of the studio's brand new Burbank facility. The film cost $600,000. Only 40 minutes of the film were animated. The first third was shot in black and white, the rest in Technicolor. Alfred Worker was borrowed from 20th Century Fox to direct the live-action segments. While on the Disney lot, Worker encountered a production technique the animators used called storyboarding, the practice of laying out a film's narrative visually before shooting. He was so impressed that he brought the concept back to live-action filmmaking, where it became an industry standard still used on every major production today. The Reluctant Dragon opened and returned just $960,000 in worldwide rentals. Number 3. The Black Cauldron, 1985. The Black Cauldron had been in development since 1971. It spent over a decade in various stages of story development and active animation before reaching the screen. The budget was $44 million. The score was composed by Elmer Bernstein. There were no songs. It was the first Disney animated film to contain absolutely no musical numbers, the first to receive a PG rating from the MPAA, the first to incorporate computer-generated imagery, and the first since Sleeping Beauty to be shot in 70mm widescreen Technorama. Behind the scenes, a young concept artist named Tim Burton worked on the production, and during his downtime began sketching a character called Jack Skellington. When test screenings revealed that children were fleeing the theater in terror during the climactic sequence where the Horned King raises an army of undead warriors from the cauldron, newly appointed studio chairman Jeffrey Katzenberg ordered the film cut. Producer Joe Hale refused. So, Katzenberg took the film into an editing bay and began cutting it himself. CEO Michael Eisner intervened and convinced Katzenberg to stop, but the damage was already done. The film that reached theaters was a compromised, disjointed version of what the animators had intended. Number 2. Treasure Planet, 2002. Ron Clements and John Musker first pitched this film in 1985, the same meeting where they pitched The Little Mermaid. Disney said yes to the mermaid and no to the space pirates. Clements and Musker didn't give up. They pitched Treasure Planet again after finishing The Little Mermaid. Rejected. They pitched it again after Aladdin. Rejected. When Disney approached them about directing Hercules, they agreed on one condition. The studio would let them make Treasure Planet immediately afterward. This time, Disney honored the deal, but only after Roy E. Disney personally intervened and pressured CEO Michael Eisner to greenlight the project. Development officially began after Hercules wrapped in 1997. Principal animation started in 2000 with roughly 350 crew members, eventually growing to over 1,000 people. The final credits listed approximately 400 artists, 150 musicians, and 200 technologists. The film pioneered a technique called deep canvas that layered hand-drawn 2D characters over 3D computer-generated environments, creating a visual style unlike anything in animation history. The budget reached $140 million. It was the first film ever released simultaneously in regular theaters and IMAX, and it opened on Thanksgiving weekend 2002 to $12 million. Adjusted for inflation, Treasure Planet lost approximately $128 million. Number 1. Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, 1927. In 1927, Walt Disney was a 25-year-old animator running a small studio in Los Angeles, still recovering from the bankruptcy of Laugh-O-Gram and the modest success of the Alice comedies. His distributor, Charles Mintz, had secured a deal with Universal Pictures to produce a new series of animated shorts starring a character Universal had already named, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Disney and his lead animator Ub Iwerks designed the look, built the personality, and brought Oswald to life. The first short, Poor Papa, was rejected by Universal executives, who said the character looked too old. Iwerks redesigned him. The second short, Trolley Troubles, was a hit. Over the next year, Disney Studio produced 26 Oswald cartoons, and the character became a genuine sensation. In fact, Oswald was the first Disney creation to generate licensed merchandise. There was a candy bar, a stencil set, and a pinback button, some of the earliest cartoon character products in American history. Everything was working. Then, in February 1928, Walt traveled to New York to renegotiate his contract with Mintz. What he found when he arrived destroyed him. Mintz told Disney he was cutting the per-film budget by more than half. When Disney protested, Mintz revealed the trap. He had already hired away the majority of Disney's animation staff behind his back. Worse, because the contract had been structured through Mintz and Universal, Disney learned that he did not own Oswald. Universal held the copyright. The character, the merchandise revenue, the entire franchise belonged to someone else, regardless of who had actually created it. Mintz offered to let Disney stay on as a salaried employee, working on a character he had built but would never own. Disney refused. Before leaving New York, he wired his brother Roy and told him to lock down an exclusive contract with Ub Iwerks, the one animator who had stayed loyal. On the train ride back to California, Walt Disney began sketching a new character, a mouse. That mouse would become Mickey. and Walt Disney would never again allow anyone to own what he created. If this video opened your eyes to a side of Disney you'd never seen before, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we go deeper than anyone else, and we're just getting started.